Boy Scout Cave Incident. On December 27, 2003, a group of 8 boys and 2 counselors set out for Boy Scout Cave in Florida. Among them were 15-year-old Michael Shiro and 16-year-old Javik Henderson, both eager for adventure. The cave was known for its narrow crawlways and sharp turns, but it was considered safe due to its stable structure. Their counselors were unable to navigate the tight passages due to their size, which is why they decided to stay outside, leaving the boys to explore. The cave's air was cool, and the light from 9 flashlights flickered through the dark passages. The group crawled deeper into the cave, undeterred by the oppressive silence that surrounded them. After about an hour, they reached a particularly difficult section known as the hairpin curve. The narrow passage twisted at a sharp angle, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through. Michael, determined to lead, pressed forward, followed by Henderson. But as Henderson tried to maneuver around the sharp bend, he became stuck, unable to move forward or back. Panic set in as his breathing quickened, realizing he was trapped. Michael crawled back to help, but as he wedged himself into the narrow space, the walls of the cave scraped against their skin, making it harder to move. The group, waiting in the wider section of the cave, grew anxious. For over an hour, the two struggled. Henderson's body twisted painfully in the tight passage, and sharp edges of the rock dug into his ribs and hips. Each attempt to move only seemed to make things worse. As time passed, the situation grew dire. Then, disaster struck. Michael, exhausted and cold, collapsed. Henderson was left in the dark, unable to help his friend. His cries for help echoed in the cave, but the other boys, too afraid to approach, could only panic and watch helplessly. Outside, the counselors were still unaware of the crisis unfolding inside. It wasn't until the boys made their way back to the entrance, frantic and out of breath, that they finally explained what had happened. The counselors immediately extinguished the fire they had lit and called 911. Rescue teams arrived quickly, equipped with tools and experience. Inside the cave, the air was thick with fear. The boys, pale and trembling, huddled together, unable to comprehend the gravity of their situation. The rescuers, understanding the risks of hypothermia and oxygen depletion, moved swiftly to reach Michael and Henderson. When the rescue team reached the hairpin curve, the sight was grim. Henderson was still conscious, but his movements were sluggish and his skin clammy. Michael, however, lay slumped just ahead, unresponsive and cold to the touch. The rescuers worked methodically, chiseling away at the limestone first to widen the narrow passage. Each strike echoed through the cave, adding to the tension. It took over an hour to free Henderson. As he was pulled from the hairpin curve, he let out a sob of relief, though his body remained stiff and trembling. The rescuers wrapped him in a thermal blanket and dragged him through the narrow passages towards the surface. With Henderson's save, attention turned to Michael, who was still in an unconscious state. After 2 hours of grueling work, they freed Michael. His pulse was weak, but it was there. They carefully secured him in a harness and began the painstaking process of carrying him to the surface. As they emerged into the daylight, emergency medical teams rushed to stabilize the boys. Michael, still unconscious, was quickly treated for hypothermia. It took him an entire day to regain consciousness, but miraculously, he survived. Red Knolls Cave Incident. It was December 21, 1997, a chilly evening in Arizona, when 5 young men, Brandon Silverhorn, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt, set out for the Safford Shafts, a desolate area also known as Red Knolls. This wasn't your typical hangout spot. The landscape was pockmarked with deep pits, some plunging 40 to 60 feet into the hardened bed of what was once an ancient lake. One of the pits was capped by a 4-foot-thick rock covering 60 feet of silt. It was a strange setting for a night of adventure, but that's exactly what they were seeking. They arrived around 9 p.m., armed with gasoline and reckless excitement. In the midst of steep drops and towering cliffs, their attention was drawn to a narrow crack in the rock, barely a foot wide. The plan: to turn this crack into a fire-spewing spectacle. Without hesitation, they poured 4 gallons of gasoline down the crevice. 4 gallons. Then, one of them lit a rag, tossed it in, and stepped back. For a moment, silence. Then, an explosion ripped through the earth. The ground literally blew apart. Fire and debris shot skyward, the fissure expanding into a gaping hole. The sheer force hurled 4 of the men backward, bruised and scraped but alive. But Brandon Silverhorn was standing too close. He had been peeking into the crack when the explosion struck. The ground beneath him crumbled and he disappeared, falling straight down, 40 feet into the pit. The impact was brutal. His leg hit first, snapping with a sickening crack. He tumbled deeper into the crevice, dirt and rock cascading down after him. Before he could react, a massive slab of rock, 3 feet by 5 feet, slid from above, burying him beneath it. He was pinned, twisted at an unnatural angle, his head forced sideways against the rock. His broken leg throbbed with pain, and the pressure on his abdomen and kidneys turned every breath into agony. Dust filled his lungs, choking any attempt to call for help. Above, his friends screamed his name, but no response came. Panic surged through them. They couldn't see him through the swirling dust and darkness. There was no way they could pull him out on their own. Desperate, they bolted to their car and raced back to town to get help. Rescuers arrived within the hour. When they saw the scene, they knew this would be a long, dangerous night. The slab covering Brandon wasn't just heavy, it was wedged deep, almost part of the earth itself. The tilt of the crevice made things even worse. If they weren't careful, any movement could send more rock tumbling down. Meanwhile, Brandon was barely clinging to consciousness. His leg was mangled, his body crushed, his breath shallow from the relentless pressure on his chest. Hypothermia set in as the cold leached the warmth from his body. Hours passed. The first challenge was the slab. Rescuers used chisels, carefully loosening its edges. Each strike sent more debris into the crevice, making every second a risk. A pulley system was rigged above, ropes secured to hooks drilled into the surrounding rock. It took 6 men pulling with every ounce of strength to lift the slab, inch by inch. Finally, with one last heave, they moved it out of the way. Next, the rescuers began digging. They worked methodically, pulling away dirt and rocks, each motion slow and deliberate to avoid further collapse. Below them, Brandon was silent. Dust had caked his throat, making even a whisper impossible. His mind drifted on the edge of consciousness, wavering between survival and surrender. After grueling hours, the rescuers reached him. To their disbelief, he was still alive. By all logic, he should have been dead. The weight, the lack of air, the injuries, it should have been fatal. But somehow, he was breathing, barely. The final stage was getting him to the surface. Rescuers carefully secured a harness around his limp body, immobilizing his shattered leg. With extreme caution, they lifted him inch by inch, ensuring no sudden movement worsened his condition. Every pull was deliberate, every breath held in anticipation. After nearly 12 excruciating hours, Brandon emerged from the pit. His leg was unnatural, swollen and twisted. His face, pale and smeared with dirt, was drained of life. His body was ice cold, and his breathing was shallow. Rushed to the hospital, doctors discovered he had suffered kidney failure, a broken leg, and severe hypothermia. His survival was nothing short of a miracle. Gunbarrel Passage Incident. In January 1970, a group of 31 adventurers gathered, bundled up against the bitter winter air. The crunch of snow beneath their boots echoed as they made their way to Knolls Cave, which had earned a reputation for one particularly notorious feature, the gun barrel. The gun barrel was a narrow, keyhole-shaped tunnel, only 18 inches wide and stretching 60 feet in length. Anyone who dared to enter had to squeeze through this tight space, a challenging feat that many considered a badge of honor. It was a test of both physical and mental endurance, separating casual explorers from those truly willing to push their limits. Most of the group was determined to pass through the gun barrel and reach the untouched sections of the cave that lay beyond. After hiking through the snow-covered forest, they arrived at the cave's entrance, an icy, snow-filled sinkhole leading into the dark and cold mouth of the cave. One by one, they descended into the depths, the temperature dropping as they left the world of light behind. The atmosphere inside was scary, with only the sound of dripping water and the soft shuffle of boots on rock. Among the group, 19 people decided to tackle the gun barrel, including 14-year-old Peter Venn. This was Peter's first caving trip, and he was eager to prove himself. He watched as the others entered the narrow passage, some moving quickly, confident in their abilities, while others hesitated and moved cautiously. When it was Peter's turn, he took a deep breath and plunged in. The tunnel was even tighter than he had imagined, and his body scraped against the jagged rock walls as he wriggled forward, using his elbows and knees to inch along. The air was thin, and his breathing became shallow. Every few feet, he had to stop and catch his breath, the weight of the rock pressing on him. Just 8 feet from the exit, disaster struck. As Peter pushed forward, his knee slipped into a narrow crevice in the floor. At first, he thought it was a minor inconvenience, but when he tried to pull his knee free, it refused to move. Panic set in. He twisted and pulled, but each attempt only made it worse. His knee was stuck, wedged in the rock. Peter called out, his voice shaking with fear, but the group ahead of him continued moving, unaware of his situation. It wasn't until one by one they realized something was wrong. They turned back to find Peter trapped, blocking the narrow tunnel. No one could move forward or backward. They were stuck. The group tried everything to free Peter, pulling on his leg, twisting his body, shifting him, but nothing worked. Each tug caused him to cry out in pain. Eventually, they had to stop, and time began to drag on in the cold, cramped tunnel. The temperature dropped further, and hypothermia became a real threat. The cavers huddled together for warmth, terrified and exhausted. Outside, the rest of the group began to grow anxious, noticing that the others hadn't returned. One person ventured into the cave to check on them, and when he reached the gun barrel, he was horrified to find Peter trapped, with the group stuck behind him. He rushed back to the surface to raise the alarm. By late afternoon, police officers and firefighters arrived. They quickly realized that this was no ordinary cave rescue. The narrowness of the gun barrel made it impossible to simply pull Peter free, and any sudden movements could cause serious injury. Hours passed with no progress. At one point, Peter, delirious with fear and exhaustion, began shouting about a snake biting him, though there was no snake, only his mind playing tricks in the cold, dark cave. As night fell, the situation became more desperate. The temperature inside the cave had dropped to dangerous levels, and if Peter couldn't be freed soon, the cold could claim not just him, but the others trapped behind him. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., after hours of struggle, the rescuers devised a new plan. They handed a thermos of soapy water down to the group, hoping to lubricate Peter's knee and free it from the crevice. They carefully poured the soapy water around his leg while the firefighters tied a rope around his ankle. With everyone coordinating their efforts, they carefully pulled on Peter's leg while those inside the cave wriggled beside him, easing the pressure on his knee. Slowly but surely, his knee began to shift. With one final gentle pull, his leg popped free. Relief washed over the group, but the rescue wasn't done yet. They had to make sure Peter didn't slip back into the crevice. Carefully, they guided him the rest of the way through the tight passage until he was finally clear. One by one, the others behind him crawled out to safety, exhausted but unharmed. Peter had sustained fractures and bruises, and he was treated for hypothermia before being admitted to the hospital for a few days to allow his leg to recover. Veryovkina Cave tragedy. In March 1997, two friends, Andrew and Attila, planned a caving expedition to explore Veryovkina, a cave in Tennessee with a notorious 160-foot entrance pit. Andrew, who was 32, had more experience, having been on numerous caving trips. Attila, 26, was relatively new to the sport, having only visited 5 caves before, but his enthusiasm was undeniable. As the day of their adventure arrived, the weather was overcast with light rain, and they approached the cave entrance. The sound of the waterfall cascading into the pit was louder than expected. Though they had wetsuits in the car, neither thought they'd need them in the cold weather, a decision they would regret later. Despite the intensity of the waterfall, they proceeded, underestimating how cold it would feel and how quickly it would sap their strength. The ropes were rigged in the waterfall's path, and Attila forgot to bring his helmet, a detail he didn't think about in his excitement. Their anticipation clouded their judgment as they began the descent. Andrew rappelled down first, feeling the sting of the cold water as he descended. By the time he reached the bottom, he was already shivering from the chill. Attila followed, but the water made the rope slippery, and his ascent was slow and exhausting. 30 minutes into their exploration, Attila began feeling the effects of the cold, his body shaking uncontrollably. He told Andrew he could not stay any longer and needed to leave. Andrew, too cold to argue, agreed and began preparing the ropes. Attila hurriedly rigged his climbing system, using a commercial seat harness, a hand-tied chest harness, and a Petzl ascender. The cow's tail was too long, and the shunt, which was meant to act as a backup safety device, only caused more trouble. Attila also connected 6 non-locking carabiners to his harness, an unsafe improvisation that would soon lead to complications. Andrew noticed the rushed setup but said nothing as Attila began climbing. The freezing water made Attila's hands numb, and he struggled with the shunt, which kept slipping and failing to grip the rope. When he was halfway up, the chain of carabiners connecting his ascender to his harness came undone, leaving him dangling by the cow's tail. Attila could not reach the ascender to adjust it. He tried to call to Andrew, but his words were muffled by the roar of the waterfall. When he shouted that he could not continue, Andrew realized the danger and climbed up toward him, determined to rescue his friend. When Andrew reached Attila, he found him hanging limp, his body almost paralyzed by the cold. Hypothermia had set in, and Andrew knew that only a pick-off maneuver, in which he would attach Attila to his own harness and descend together, could save him. Despite his training, Andrew's fingers were numb, and the freezing conditions made it nearly impossible to complete the maneuver. After several failed attempts, he realized the situation was too dire, and he tried another method, climbing out while tied to Attila. However, the added weight was too much, and after only 15 feet, Andrew's strength gave out. Now both were stuck, with Attila slipping into unconsciousness, and Andrew was too weak to continue. Desperate, Andrew managed to swing over to a ledge and unclip from the rope. Exhausted, he collapsed, his body shivering from the cold, and passed out. When he woke up hours later, his body was stiff and disoriented. He saw that Attila was still hanging motionless in the waterfall. It was clear that his friend was gone. Realizing that he could do nothing more, Andrew cut the tether that connected them. With great sorrow, he climbed out of the cave alone. Once outside, he collapsed and called for help. Rescue teams arrived and found Attila's body still suspended in the waterfall. A doctor on the scene confirmed what Andrew already knew. Attila had succumbed to hypothermia hours earlier. In the aftermath, Andrew reflected on the mistakes they had made, the unsecure carabiners, the rushed decisions, and the oversight of critical safety measures. What began as an exciting adventure had turned into a tragic loss. Culverson Creek Cave tragedy. On the cold afternoon of November 28, 1985, 7 cavers entered Culverson Creek Cave in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Heavy rainfall had caused severe flooding, forcing them to abandon their original plan to explore Friar's Hole. Culverson, though unfamiliar, seemed like a safer option. The cave featured a 5 to 8 foot wide canyon with a shallow, fast-flowing stream over loose rock slabs. Just 50 feet in, they encountered a massive 5-foot-tall boulder partially blocking the passage. They had 2 choices: climb over it or squeeze through a narrow gap where the stream rushed by. 3 cavers passed safely. Eric Tacey, a 26-year-old experienced caver, led the next group. He chose the left-hand route, stepping carefully through the stream. Just as he reached the center of the boulder, disaster struck. The massive rock shifted. The cavers tried to stop it, but their efforts were futile. The boulder crashed into the narrow corridor, pinning Eric against the cave wall. His left temple and shoulder pressed against the rock, his right cheekbone trapped against the cold stone. His legs dangled beneath him, completely immobilized. The immense weight crushed his chest, making it harder to breathe. Panic set in as his friends desperately tried to help. One rushed out for help, while the others attempted to move the boulder. They pushed with all their strength and used crowbars, but the rock was too heavy. Eric remained conscious for about 30 seconds. Each breath became shallower until his body went still. A small trickle of blood ran from his left nostril, and his pulse faded. One caver tried to prop him up, but the pressure was relentless. The only sounds left were the distant rush of water and the frantic beating of their hearts. At 4:20 p.m., nearly an hour later, rescuers arrived with a hydraulic jack. Time was running out. With combined efforts, they managed to shift the boulder just enough to free Eric's lifeless body. His friends dragged him to a dry spot and immediately started CPR, hands trembling. Minutes felt like a race against fate. Every chest compression, every desperate breath carried hope. But Eric wasn't responding. His skin turned pale, and though his body was still warm, life was slipping away. Paramedics arrived and took over, working tirelessly for over an hour. At 5:25 p.m., Eric was carried out on a stretcher and rushed to the hospital. Doctors administered IVs and cardiac drugs in a final attempt to save him. Despite all efforts, it was too late. Eric Tacey was pronounced dead, his life stolen by a tragic accident none of his friends could have foreseen. The cave that had seemed like a safer choice had become his tomb. Alcove Pit tragedy. On September 5, 2013, Brett Smith and his friends set out for a hunting trip in the remote backwoods of New Mexico. The landscape was desolate, vast stretches of dusty rock and occasional patches of forest. They had only basic supplies and a nylon rope for emergencies. Neither was prepared for caving. Then they spotted it, a jagged pit, nearly camouflaged by the rugged terrain. Brett leaned over the edge. The opening was wide but tapered sharply down into darkness, about 35 feet deep. Locals called it Alcove Pit, a dangerous, unmarked sinkhole known among cavers for its deceptive shape and sharp drops. Brett felt drawn to it. Despite having no caving experience or proper gear, he made a reckless decision. He was going in. His friend hesitated, but Brett brushed off his concerns. He tied their nylon rope, a thin, multi-purpose cord not designed for climbing, to a tree and began his descent. As he lowered himself, the walls closed in. He braced his feet against the rock, maneuvering awkwardly to avoid scraping against the jagged surface. The deeper he went, the tighter the space became. His arms burned with strain as he clung to the rope, feeling gravity's pull with every inch. Then his foot slipped. Loose rocks tumbled below, their echoes deep and chilling. Brett's breathing quickened. He was too far down. Looking up, he saw how high he was. Panic set in. His muscles cramped, his fingers barely holding on. He shouted to his friend that he was coming back up, but his voice sounded weak. Above, his friend panicked, searching for a solution. Desperate, he tied the rope to their ATV, hoping to pull Brett up. As the ATV inched forward, Brett felt the rope tighten unnaturally. He shouted for his friend to stop, but it was too late. Snap, the rope gave way. Brett fell nearly 20 feet, his body slamming into the jagged rocks below. Agony exploded through him. His chest burned with every shallow gasp. His limbs ached, refusing to move. Above, his friend stood frozen at the edge. Silence. No movement. No cries. Only the memory of that sickening thud. Desperation gripped him. He dialed emergency services, his hands shaking. Rescuers arrived quickly, lowering ropes and calling Brett's name. The pit offered no response. When they reached the bottom, they found Brett motionless, his body wedged between jagged rocks. The fall had been catastrophic. His injuries were severe, a cruel testament to the brutal impact. Despite his struggle, he hadn't made it. Rescuers worked to lift his body, carefully navigating the fragile crevice. Hours later, they emerged. Alcove Pit stood silent once more, an empty scar in the earth, a reminder of recklessness and tragedy. Veryovkina Cave tragedy. Sergei Kozyev, A 37-year-old father and thrill-seeker from Sochi, Russia, had spent nearly a year obsessing over the Veryovkina Cave, the deepest cave on Earth at over 1.3 miles deep. Despite having only caved twice before, Sergei became captivated by the challenge and mystery of this vast subterranean labyrinth. The cave, with its overwhelming depth and near-impossible complexity, seemed like an ultimate test for anyone daring enough to face it. To Sergei, it wasn't just a geological marvel, it was something more, a pilgrimage. The Veryovkina Cave is a place of staggering difficulty, notorious for its dangerous and complex features. At its base lies a horizontal system that stretches half a mile, filled with razor-thin ledges, rope drops, and narrow, water-filled sumps. The cave demands extraordinary skill and meticulous planning to navigate. Professional cavers from the Russian Perovo Speleo team, among the most seasoned in the world, had taken days to descend and ascend it safely. They moved in teams, with a relay system to transport hundreds of pounds of gear and food. Every step was calculated, every possible hazard accounted for. Sergei had heard of the dangers the cave posed, including a near-fatal flash flood that occurred in 2018 during a joint expedition with National Geographic photographer Robbie Schoen. While deep underground, the team was suddenly struck by the sound of a distant rumble, which soon turned into the deafening roar of a freight train. The flood surged through the cave, forcing the team to abandon their camp and scramble for higher ground. The water turned a vertical shaft into a waterfall, battering them with freezing spray and nearly drowning them in its ferocity. The team barely escaped with their lives, but the entire lower camp was submerged, leaving behind only a chilling reminder of nature's power. For Sergei, this near disaster didn't act as a deterrent. It ignited something inside him. He studied the photographs from the expedition, pored over maps, and read every available report. The cave wasn't a place to fear. It was an ultimate challenge, one that demanded his presence. Sergei became determined to face the Veryovkina Cave on his own terms. On November 1st, 2020, Sergei set off for the Caucasus Mountains, planning to embark on a solo expedition to the cave. He told his wife and children that he was leaving for a personal journey to search for the meaning of life. He didn't mention his real destination. He didn't even tell them he was heading to Veryovkina. The cave, he believed, was his to conquer, and he intended to do so alone. His family would be none the wiser. The journey to the cave was already an incredible challenge. Sergei hiked several kilometers up the forested mountainside to reach the cave's entrance. The terrain was treacherous, slick with moisture, and he navigated it carefully with new crampons and trekking poles. At the gaping entrance of Veryovkina, he stopped to gather himself. There was no official permit for his entry, no radio to call for help, and no team to support him. He was entirely alone, armed only with a rope and a plan he'd drawn from YouTube videos and online forums. Yet, with unwavering determination, he clipped into his rope and began his descent. The first vertical drop was immense, plunging him into an eerie, suffocating silence. Sergei rappelled down into the darkness, his headlamp casting ghostly shadows on the cave's jagged walls. He lowered his gear in waterproof bags, inching further into the Earth's depths. That night, Sergei camped over 1,000 feet underground. He settled in a base camp previously used by the Perovo team, eating a simple meal, logging his location in the journal, and preparing for the next day. The second day brought even greater challenges. Sergei navigated steep drops and narrow shafts, the rock walls closing in on him as the temperature dropped. The cave grew colder, more isolating, and darker with each passing moment. Finally, he reached another underground camp, this one deeper, colder, and lonelier than the last. Food caches left by previous teams were still present, and old logs offered a glimpse into their experiences. Sergei boiled water, ate a meal, and made a final entry in the camp's journal. November 3rd. That would be the last time anyone heard from him. When the Perovo Speleo team returned to the cave on November 6th, they immediately sensed something was wrong. They noticed signs of tampering, misplaced gear, and unfamiliar footprints in the dirt. Alarm bells rang. Sergei had been there, and he had gone deeper. As they descended into the cave, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Sergei, with no experience or backup, had ventured beyond his limits, moving deeper into the uncharted territory. It wasn't long before they found him. Near the bottom of the cave, close to a freezing sump, a water-filled end of the main descent, they found Sergei's body. He lay face up in a shallow pool, his headlamp glowing weakly, casting a faint, eerie light. His camera, along with his gear, was nearby, as was a plastic container that held his notes. He had kept detailed records throughout the journey, and his final entries offered insight into his state of mind before he passed. Authorities believe Sergei may have thought he'd reached the cave's final chamber. Eager to mark the moment symbolically, he may have attempted a short swim in the freezing water. However, the water, barely above freezing, quickly sapped his energy. Without a wetsuit, already fatigued and dehydrated, Sergei likely slipped into unconsciousness. A head injury could not be ruled out, and the freezing temperatures would have quickly overwhelmed him. Sergei Koziev died alone in the darkness, deep inside Veryovkina Cave. Cueva Cheve's tragedy. Cueva, nestled high in the mountains of northwest Oaxaca, Mexico, rises to 8,858 feet above sea level. It is one of the deepest caves on Earth, a mysterious abyss that calls to the most seasoned cavers. Every year, these elite explorers return to the cave, driven by an insatiable hunger for discovery, the thrill of pushing their endurance to the edge, and the urge to explore the unknown depths of the Earth. For those who have braved its tunnels, the cave is both a marvel and a threat, a place where danger and wonder exist in equal measure. In late February 1991, a team of 14 highly skilled cavers arrived at the entrance of Cueva with a singular mission: to reach and clear dive a sump deep within the cave's furthest explored point. This was no small task. The journey to the farthest reaches of the cave required descending 115 vertical drops, rigging ropes along the way to protect them from the sharp, abrasive rock faces. To accomplish this, rebelays were installed, forcing cavers to disconnect and reconnect their rappel gear midair. The task required total focus, precision, and coordination. A mistake could mean the difference between life and death. By February 25th, 6 cavers had successfully descended to Camp 2, 2,790 feet below ground. Over the next few days, others rotated in and out, bringing in much-needed gear and supplies for the team as they pushed deeper into the cave. The work was grueling, each step taken with the knowledge that they were entering a vast, dark realm where danger was never far away. On March 1st, Peter Bostad and Peter Haberland re-entered the cave with James Brown, who was recovering from a shoulder injury, and Chris Yeager, who had recently battled illness. They entered in staggered pairs to avoid congestion in the narrow passages of the cave. Yeager and Haberland moved forward, navigating the winding, wet shafts of Saknum's well. As they descended deeper, the cave narrowed further. At one point, Yeager accidentally dropped his rappel rack, an essential piece of gear for controlling descent. It was a small mistake, one that could happen to anyone, but in a place like Cueva, even small mistakes carry heavy consequences. Haberland, ever the professional, lent him his own rack, and Yeager was able to retrieve it. But even the smallest errors seemed to weigh on the team's nerves. By the evening, the two were nearing Camp 2. They had passed through a vast network of dry passages but had briefly lost their way in the labyrinthine corridors. They finally found the route to the final descent, the 2-pitch drop into the East Gorge. The first part was a sloped 33-foot drop to a rebelay. The second was a 75-foot free-hanging vertical shaft. Haberland went first, navigating the rigging with careful precision. The rebelay anchor was awkwardly low, forcing him to use a foot ascender to create slack and pass the point safely. Once at the bottom, he called out to Yeager, signaling that the line was clear. But then, the silence was shattered by the sound of a rock falling. A rushing gust of air followed. Then, a sickening thud. Haberland called out, but there was no answer. Heart racing, he peered over the edge, his stomach sinking. There, in the shallow pool at the base of the drop, lay Yeager, motionless. His body was contorted in an unnatural position. One leg was twisted in a way it should never bend. His helmet was askew, and his pack pressed his body into the water. Fear surged through Haberland, but he knew what he had to do. Panicking could make things worse. He quickly descended to Yeager's side, carefully checking his condition. His first instinct was to turn his head to ensure he wasn't drowning, but there was no response. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Overwhelmed but determined, Haberland ran the long distance to Camp 2 in just 15 minutes, his mind racing with thoughts of how to save his friend. Bostad and Brown were there. Together they grabbed gear and rushed back to where Yeager lay. When they reached him, the sight was grim. His face was pale, blood trickled from his nose, and his body remained unresponsive. Bostad quickly checked for a pulse but found nothing. They pulled Yeager from the water and wrapped him in a sleeping bag, performing CPR with all the skill they could muster. Each breath forced into his lungs made a sickening gurgling sound. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. They continued the efforts for 20 minutes, but it became painfully clear that their attempts were in vain. His body began to swell, and a flashlight to his eyes revealed no reaction. Shortly after, he was declared dead. Al-Qara Mountain tragedy. Ayman al-Asmaq, a 36-year-old man from the village of Al-Tuwaithir in Al-Asa Governorate, decided to explore Mount Al-Qara one Saturday afternoon. He wasn't a professional climber, but he loved nature and photography. often sharing photos of his adventures with friends on Snapchat. Mount Al-Qara wasn't one of the region's tallest peaks, but it was known for its rugged beauty, jagged limestone cliffs, narrow ridges, and sudden cracks that cut deep into the rock. It was the perfect place to capture dramatic pictures, but it also held hidden dangers. That day, the weather was clear and the wind was calm. Ayman set out alone, aiming to reach a spot near the summit of Zima, about 15 kilometers east of Hofuf. He moved carefully across the sharp rocks, hopping between boulders and navigating the uneven ground. As he climbed higher, the landscape grew more treacherous. Between the stone faces, deep and narrow cracks split the surface, some of them just a few inches wide, others several feet deep. As evening approached, Ayman pulled out his phone and made a call to one of his relatives. His voice was hoarse and strained. He said he had gotten stuck somewhere but couldn't clearly describe where he was. Before he could give more information, the call suddenly cut off. After that, all attempts to reach him failed. His phone rang a few times but soon went silent. When Ayman didn't return home that night, his family alerted the authorities. Civil defense teams, along with dozens of volunteers, began searching the mountain under the cover of darkness. They used flashlights and loudspeakers, hoping that if Ayman was still alive, he would hear them. Hours turned into a full day, but there was no sign of him. By Sunday afternoon, a volunteer noticed something glinting at the bottom of a narrow crack between two limestone slabs. It was a smartphone, its screen shattered but still recognizable. Nearby, wedged deep inside the stone, they found Ayman's body. He had fallen into a crevice barely wide enough for a human body to slip through. He was trapped vertically, with his arms pinned to his sides and his chest compressed by the stone walls. The intense pressure restricted his breathing, and gravity pushed his blood downward, causing his body to swell inside the narrow space. Combined with the searing desert heat, the swelling grew worse by the hour. When rescuers first reached him, they hoped he might still be alive, but it quickly became clear that Ayman had already passed away. His skin was pale, and he was completely unresponsive. The brutal position had likely taken his life within hours after his final phone call. For the next 2 days, the rescue teams worked carefully, breaking apart the stone piece by piece. Specialized cutting tools were brought in, but progress was slow. The crack was so narrow that even simple movements were difficult, and every effort risked causing more harm. Finally, after nearly 3 full days of work, on Tuesday evening, they freed Ayman's body from the mountain. Abbey Caves tragedy. On May 9, 2023, a group of students visited Abbey Caves, located just outside Whangarei in Northland, New Zealand. It's a popular destination for adventurers and school groups looking to explore underground rock formations and stunning limestone passages. The caves, including Organ Cave, Middle Cave, and Ivy Cave, are known for their beauty, but also pose significant risks. These caves are largely unregulated and are subject to rapid flooding during heavy rainfall, making them dangerous, especially for inexperienced explorers. The weather had been questionable all week. A thunderstorm warning was in place for Northland, and heavy rain was expected later in the day. Despite this, a group of Year 11 students had successfully completed a caving trip on May 8th, emerging from the caves without issue. Encouraged by that, Whangarei Boys High School pressed ahead with the next group's trip to Organ Cave. The night before, some parents grew uneasy, with one emailing the school asking if the trip was still happening. After receiving confirmation, they chose to keep their son home. Karnan's mother, Alicia Toki, shared the same concern. She sent an email asking if the caves were safe. The school responded shortly after, reassuring her that the trip would continue. They were monitoring the weather closely, expecting the heavy rain to hit around 3 p.m. The students would be out of the caves by 1:30 p.m. On the morning of May 9th, the school checked the weather again. The rain radar showed a storm hovering above Kaipara, but no new warnings were issued for Whangarei. The decision was made to continue the trip, though only Organ Cave would be explored. By 9 a.m., 17 students, a teacher, and a responsible adult arrived at Abbey Caves. The rain had been light, and they suited up in overalls, helmets, headlamps, and gumboots, leaving their phones in the van. Reception was non-existent inside the caves. 30 minutes after arrival, they entered Organ Cave. Outside, rain pounded Whangarei, and the storm clouds grew darker. Water rushed along roads and sidewalks, and rivers swelled, their surfaces broken by relentless rain. Andre Peter, Karnan's father, saw the transformation unfolding. His backyard was turning into a shallow pond. Puddles expanded into pools. Concerned, he checked weather reports and saw rain warnings, flood risks, and storm advisories. The forecast had been wrong. The heavy rain wasn't arriving in the afternoon. It was already here. Andre called the school, asking if the group was still in the caves. The response was uncertain. 40 minutes later, he called again. But the flooding outside was worse, and the school gave no reassuring response. He called once more, but the school assured him there was nothing to worry about. Inside Organ Cave, the students had no idea what was happening above ground. They had followed a familiar route along the creek bed, stepping through shallow, crystal-clear water that trickled over smooth rock. The cave walls, damp and textured, glistened under the glow of their headlamps. The air smelled of earth, moisture, and ancient stone. After moving about 150 meters in, the passage split into two. The group took the upper passage, where the ceiling arched higher and glowworms clung to the rock, casting an eerie blue-green light that pulsed faintly. The beauty of the scene captivated the students, and they lingered for about 20 minutes, their voices hushed in awe. The water, which had barely reached their knees, was now rising. The teacher noticed something was off. The gentle trickle of water had turned into a rushing sound, the flow building in momentum. He crouched down, pressing his hand to the water, which was higher than before. Looking back at the way they had come, the entrance was no longer visible. The passage behind them was swallowed by the rising water. The teacher shouted for them to get out immediately. The group rushed to the main tunnel, but the water had become waist-deep and was moving fast. The cave had turned into a funnel, churning with relentless force. The teacher shouted for the students to hold on to each other and stay together. The students obeyed, linking arms and fighting to stay upright as the water surged against them. Some students lost their footing, and one slipped under. Karnan was in the worst possible spot, in the path of the strongest current. The water had carved a deep hole in the cave floor, transforming it into a deadly vortex. The current yanked Karnan off balance, and before he could react, he dropped into the hole, the water swallowing him up to his chest. His classmates watched in horror, frozen for a split second before one of them lunged forward. A student grabbed Karnan trying to pull him up, but the current was unrelenting. Karnan was pulled deeper into the crevice, his body twisting in the water. The student holding him struggled to maintain his grip, but the force of the water was too much. Karnan's overalls acted as anchors, dragging him down further. The student pulled with all his strength, trying to rescue Karnan, but the current grew stronger, and Karnan was torn away. His classmates saw his wide, panicked eyes and his mouth open in a silent scream before the water dragged him completely under. Outside at 10:35 a.m., the emergency call was made. Emergency responders rushed to Abbey Caves, sirens piercing the heavy rain. The 16 surviving students, soaking wet and shivering, stood near the cave entrance, their faces pale. But one was missing. Police arrived, then search and rescue teams, but the floodwaters inside the cave were still too high. For hours, there was nothing they could do. By 7 p.m., the floodwaters began to recede. Rescuers moved in, using underwater cameras to scan the cave. After hours of searching, they found Karnan's body pinned against a rock formation, his leg caught between boulders. Outside, his family had waited all day, and now their worst fear was confirmed. Karnan has died. The tragedy shocked New Zealand. Investigations revealed that the school had failed to properly assess the risks despite multiple warnings. In May 2024, WorkSafe New Zealand charged the school's board for exposing students to serious harm. The court ordered the school to pay over $500,000 in reparations in July 2024, acknowledging the devastating impact on Karnan's family and classmates. Caballo Cave Incident. On February 5, 1994, 40-year-old Leland Smith joined a youth group on a trip to Caballo Cave, located in New Mexico. Leland wasn't just tagging along, he was a dedicated volunteer and a former police officer who had spent plenty of time working with kids. The trip was being led by experienced caver Steve Pierman, and the group was made up of students and a few other adult volunteers. Caballo Cave had always been considered safe, especially for beginners. The route in and out of the cave was standard, well-traveled, and had been crossed by hundreds of people without incident. As the group moved through the cave and wrapped up their trip, they began to make their way back toward the entrance. The exit route passed through a chimney, a vertical, narrow section with large boulders and broken-down rock. Near the top of the chimney was a sloped slab of breakdown, a type of loose, fractured rock that had become part of the regular path. Steve and a few students were already up top, waiting. Leland was helping one of the remaining students up the slab, acting as the steady hand that kids rely on in a place like that. As he gave the student a boost, the unthinkable happened. A massive piece of the slab suddenly broke loose. Leland didn't have time to react. The rock, weighing hundreds of pounds, came down on him, knocking him into the narrow chimney. Then, a second section of rock broke free and fell directly on top of him. Everything happened in a flash. Steve and another adult, hearing the crash, scrambled back down the chimney. What they found was devastating. Leland was pinned beneath the slabs, motionless. He had suffered catastrophic injuries, multiple fractures to his legs, spine, and neck. He was already gone, There was nothing they could do to move the boulders. The rocks had settled deep into the crevice, wedging themselves in so tightly that even shifting them slightly was impossible. The group, shaken and horrified, made their way out of the cave and called for help. The next day, a specialized team returned for the body recovery operation. The site was unstable, and they had to use shoring equipment to keep the remaining slabs from collapsing further. The rescuers found that the slab that had crushed Leland had been held in place by flowstone cementing, a thin mineral deposit that gave it the illusion of stability. No one had known it was fragile. It had looked solid. Then, a new problem emerged. Leland, as a former police officer, had been carrying a concealed semi-automatic pistol in a shoulder holster. It was fully loaded. Before anyone could move the rock or the body, a law enforcement officer had to enter the narrow chimney and safely remove the weapon. As the operation went on, rescuers slowly began removing debris. It took hours. At one point, another slab came loose and fell, hitting one of the team members. Luckily, the rescuer only suffered a minor bruise. After a full day of excavation, Leland's body was freed and carefully removed from the cave. The slab that had killed him was on a route used by novices for years. No one had ever imagined it could collapse like that. Banshee Hole Incident. In November 1992, 4 men descended into Banshee Hole, a remote vertical cave hidden in the forests of eastern Tennessee. The cave was known for its impressive 95-foot entrance shaft, which opened into a twisting series of narrow passages and chambers below. It wasn't the most dangerous cave in the region, but it wasn't suitable for beginners either. One of the men, later referred to in reports only as the victim, had never been in a vertical cave before. His experience came mostly from reading caving books and practicing knots on trees. He had just bought some basic gear and was eager to try real caving. Despite his inexperience, he was the most enthusiastic of the group. He volunteered to go first. With help from the others, he clipped into a fixed rope that was already anchored above the entrance and rappelled down into the shaft. One by one, the others followed, descending nearly 100 feet into the earth. The group explored the horizontal sections, moving through crawl spaces and tight turns until they reached a large, unfamiliar chamber. In one corner, they noticed a small, hidden tunnel, partially covered by flowstone. It looked unexplored. But daylight was fading, and they agreed it was time to head back. The only exit was the same vertical shaft they had used to enter. To avoid putting too much strain on the rope, they decided to climb out one at a time. Once again, the least experienced member volunteered to go first. His climbing setup was dangerous. He had fashioned a chest harness out of nylon webbing that wrapped tightly around his upper torso. He had no seat harness to distribute his body weight. He used 2 mechanical ascenders called Jumars and a pair of foot slings to inch himself upward. Worse, he had clipped the webbing directly to the rope with a carabiner, meaning the full force of his body weight would be concentrated on his chest and ribs. At first, he slowly made progress. The group watched the light from his headlamp disappear as he ascended. But just 10 feet from the top, he hit a problem. Near the surface was a feature called the lip, a sharp ledge where the cave flared outward. To get past it, climbers needed to pull themselves up and over, something that required upper body strength and proper gear. Without a seat harness, the improvised chest webbing pulled tighter every time he tried to move. He couldn't breathe or reposition himself. He was trapped. The group realized something was wrong when they heard strained, shallow breathing echoing down the shaft. 2 cavers quickly climbed up to help. One tried pushing him from below, while the other adjusted the webbing. But nothing worked. It only made the harness squeeze tighter. One of the men exited the cave and called for help. Roughly 40 minutes later, rescue personnel arrived. A team rappelled down and rigged a pulley system to lift him the final few feet. As soon as they pulled his body over the lip, it went limp. CPR was started immediately, but it was too late. The man had gone into cardiac arrest, likely caused by positional asphyxia, his lungs compressed by the chest harness during prolonged suspension. At 1:52 a.m., the victim was officially declared dead. Ellison's Cave Tragedy. 10 students, 5 boys and 5 girls, from the University of Florida decided to go caving. The lead planner was 20-year-old Grant Lockenbach, who was to celebrate his birthday the following week. Grant, Michael, and some of the other students had gone caving before. This looked to be just another adventure. On February 12, 2011, they decided to explore Ellison's Cave, an over 1,000-foot deep cave nestled in Walker County on Pigeon Mountain in Georgia. This cave is considered the 12th deepest in America. But what's more striking is that it houses the deepest freefall pit in the U.S., the Fantastic Pit, nearly twice as tall as the Statue of Liberty. To get there, the students traveled over 400 miles the previous day. They reached Georgia in the afternoon and booked a hotel close to the wildlife management area where Pigeon Mountain is located. The following day, they got up enthusiastically and prepared for the climb. Dressed in casual clothing, they packed their caving essentials, headlamps, helmets, and ropes, into their vehicles. But they left their phones behind, a decision they would come to regret. As the group ascended the mountain, the cold intensified. Unfortunately, no one had thought to bring warmer clothing. After nearly an hour of hiking, the group reached one of the cave entrances, a narrow opening jagged around its edges. It was so small that only one person could pass through at a time. They couldn't see beyond it, but the darkness beckoned. One by one, they entered and were soon enveloped by darkness, lit only by their headlamps. Inside, the beauty of the cave amazed them, but they still had the biting cold to contend with. In the summer, the water in the cave is around 56 degrees Fahrenheit, so it was much colder in winter. The group settled on a brief exploration before heading back. Nobody was planning to bathe in the freezing water. But then something unexpected happened. One student's backpack fell into a vertical shaft known as the warm-up pit. Though not as deep as the Fantastic Pit, only 125 feet, it was still extremely dangerous. The temperatures there were even lower due to a roaring waterfall. Despite the risk, the backpack contained essential materials. It was supposed to be a quick drop and return. As the group leader, Grant volunteered to retrieve it. His friends warned him not to, sensing danger, but he insisted he'd be fine. They tapped him on the back and wished him good luck as he lowered himself down the pit. Grant slowly rappelled down. As the cold intensified, he began to shiver. Further down, the roar of the nearby waterfall grew louder. Still, he could hear his friends encouraging him. But halfway down, disaster struck. As he descended farther, Grant came face to face with the wailing waterfall. Now shivering violently, he tried to avoid the freezing water. But then, he heard a jolting sound from his harness and rope. He stopped moving. In panic, he tried to adjust, but the rope only tangled around him more. Eventually, the freezing water drenched him. He screamed for help, but his shouts were drowned by the waterfall and his chattering teeth. His friends heard him faintly and shouted back. Michael didn't hesitate. He strapped on the same rope and descended to help. Michael reached Grant, who was incoherent, shivering, and barely able to move. He yelled an update to the others above, but soon, Michael too became entangled. He was also soaked by the freezing waterfall. Now, both were trapped. Hearing this, the group above panicked. Some stayed behind to keep talking to the boys, while others raced down the mountain to call for help. In less than 30 minutes, they reached their car, retrieved their phones, and called 911. It was 2:19 p.m. Back in the cave, Grant and Michael's voices grew fainter. Their friends tried to keep them conscious with encouragement and prayer, but the cold was too much. It drained their energy, slowed their hearts, and weakened their lungs. After 30 minutes, their voices went silent. Their friends, devastated, could only watch the rope sway slightly in the cold air. Soon, rescue arrived. Part of the team tended to the other students while the rest descended the pit. At 3:30 p.m., they reached Grant and Michael, hanging lifeless from the rope. They checked their pulses. None. It was too late. Killiansburg Cave Nightmare. In June 1992, 10 Boy Scouts set out to explore Killiansburg Cave, a small limestone cave hidden in the hills of West Virginia. Located near the Potomac River, the cave wasn't anything extraordinary, just a narrow system of twisting passages, but it offered enough mystery and challenge to excite a group of adventurous boys on a summer outing. Among them was 13-year-old Brian Quintanilla. Curious, wiry, and observant, Brian had a knack for noticing things others missed. While most of the group stuck to the main chambers, Brian's attention was drawn to a narrow passage off to the side. It looked tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but to him, it seemed like a hidden route, maybe a shortcut to another part of the cave. Without telling anyone, he crouched down and crawled inside. The passage was immediately confining. Cool, damp rock scraped against his sides as he inched forward. It twisted in an L shape, and when Brian reached the bend, he realized he'd need to contort himself to get through. He twisted his legs at an awkward angle, hyperextending his knees and pushing himself through with difficulty. Past the bend, the tunnel widened slightly. It was still tight, but he had room to breathe. For a moment, he felt triumphant. He'd done something brave, but that feeling vanished quickly. When he tried to move backward, he realized he was stuck. The bend he had just squeezed through had locked him in place. The angle of his legs and hips made reversing nearly impossible. He tried to wriggle back, but nothing moved. Panic set in. He was alone, deep inside a tunnel no one else had even noticed. Back in the main chamber, the rest of the scouts were regrouping. Someone realized there were only 9 of them. They began calling for Brian and retracing their steps. But no one knew he had entered a narrow passage, so they kept searching the larger areas of the cave. Deep in the rock, Brian could hear their voices. Though speaking was difficult in his twisted position, he managed to call back. Eventually, they heard him. His voice was muffled, full of fear. They followed the sound and discovered his legs sticking out of the narrow tunnel. A few tried pulling gently. Others called instructions. Nothing worked. He was firmly wedged in place. Inside, Brian struggled to breathe. His chest was compressed, and his legs were locked in a painful, hyperextended position. Every attempt to shift sent sharp pain through his body. He was lightheaded, nauseous, and terrified. Word reached the scout leader, who was also Brian's mother. She rushed to the cave and crawled into the passage until she could see her son's legs. She called his name. He responded, scared, crying but conscious. She realized the only way to free him was to reverse the movement he used to get in. Brian didn't want to do it. The pain was too intense. But she spoke calmly, clearly, and began helping him inch by inch. She gripped his ankles and guided him as he screamed in agony. His knees felt like they were being torn apart. His skin scraped along the rock. Outside, the other scouts stood silently, their faces pale as they listened to the sounds echoing from deep inside the tunnel. Finally, Brian's torso came free. With one last pull, she got him out. Brian collapsed in the wider passage, sobbing and trembling. But the panic didn't stop. The cave now felt suffocating. With his mother's help, he scrambled out of the tunnel, and they made their way back through the cave as fast as they could. When they emerged into the sunlight, Brian collapsed onto the grass. He gasped for air, his face pale and streaked with tears. The rest of the group stood nearby, silent. Brian recovered physically over the next few days, but the memory of that narrow tunnel and what it took to escape never left him. Bronson Cave Incident. On the morning of July 1st, 1985, two friends, Michael Hall, 25, and Roman Lazowski, 24, stood at the mouth of Bronson Cave in Spring Hill Park near Bloomington, Indiana. Heavy rain had fallen through the night, and the air was thick with moisture. Still, they were determined. Their plan was to follow the underground stream from Bronson Cave to its exit at Donaldson Cave, a route Lazowski had explored before. Clad only in shorts and tennis shoes, and each carrying a flashlight, they stepped into the cave. But the stream they expected had turned into a powerful torrent. The water reached their waists, surging with force. At first, it was thrilling. They laughed, pushed forward, and treated it like an adventure. But soon, the current grew too strong. When they tried turning back, they realized the water was too powerful to fight. They had no choice but to continue downstream. Then, disaster struck. Lazowski lost his footing and was swept away. He slammed into the rock walls but managed to grab a narrow ledge. He shouted a warning to Hall, who tried to follow, but the water immediately overwhelmed him. His flashlight bobbed briefly above the surface before vanishing into the darkness. By a stroke of luck, Hall was swept close to the Donaldson Cave exit. There, he managed to grab a railing and pull himself out. Bruised and disoriented, he stumbled into daylight and ran for help, convinced that Lazowski hadn't made it. But inside the cave, Roman Lazowski was still alive. Freezing and alone, he spotted a small crevice just above the rushing stream. It offered a 6-inch wide ledge, just enough to wedge himself in. A former Marine with survival training, he knew he had to stay calm. The cave was 54 degrees, his clothes were soaked, and the damp air pulled the warmth from his body. He couldn't sleep, not without risking a fall. Time dragged on. He talked to himself, imagined a companion, and debated NBA draft picks just to keep his mind sharp. Periodically, he shouted for help, though his voice was lost in the stone. Outside, emergency crews assembled. Thanks to Hall's information, rescuers knew roughly where Lazowski was, but flooding prevented safe entry from either cave entrance. One team had to turn back after 600 feet. Another tried Donaldson Cave, but was stopped by a submerged ceiling. Desperate, rescuers began drilling from above. By Wednesday morning, nearly 55 hours after Lazowski had entered, rescuers equipped with wetsuits reached a low-ceilinged area in Donaldson Cave. A flashlight beam caught Lazowski's face. A voice called out. He had been found. Using a bullhorn, they urged him to stay calm. At 5 p.m., rescuer Steve Collins reached his ledge and threw a rope across the stream. Lazowski tied it off, but as they tried pulling him across, the anchor failed. Both men were swept away. Further downstream, another team was ready. They caught them. Lazowski was quickly fitted with a helmet and wetsuit top. Secured to a rope system above the stream, he was slowly guided out of the cave. At 8 p.m., he finally emerged, shivering, drained, but alive. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors treated him for hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion. After 55 hours alone in freezing darkness, Roman Lazowski had survived. Weatherly Well Cave. It was the morning of February 11, 1998, when 4 experienced cavers, James Lewis, Alan England, Darrell Moore, and Jerry Olson, stood in the cold woods of Tennessee, preparing to enter an uncharted cave. Jerry had recently discovered the entrance while ridge walking and invited the others to help him explore it. Locals referred to it as Weatherly Well, but the inside had never been mapped. The entrance alone was intimidating. A vertical slot only 9 inches wide led straight down. It opened into a 7-foot drop, followed by a second 10-foot descent. The crack was barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through, and the rock surrounding it was cold, wet, and unwelcoming. The passage beyond was dark and twisted, tight enough to make even the most seasoned caver uneasy. Alan England, the oldest at 63, but also the smallest and most agile, volunteered to go first. Despite his age, he was in excellent shape and had decades of caving experience. With a rope secured as a handline, he began to descend into the narrow opening. He sucked in his chest, twisted his shoulders, and inched downward through the unyielding stone. His clothing scraped against the damp walls, and by the time he slipped through, he was soaked and breathing hard. Once through, he dropped down into a slightly wider chamber and turned his headlamp to assess the situation. Below him was a 10-foot vertical drop into deeper darkness. The cave twisted and coiled, offering no hint of how far it went. As much as Alan wanted to explore, he knew better than to continue solo. Without another rope and no one to assist from below, it was simply too dangerous. He made the decision to turn back. Climbing back up the 10-foot drop was straightforward. Years of experience guided his movements. But when he reached the base of the tight entrance he had come through earlier, the true difficulty set in. What gravity had made simple on the way down now became nearly impossible in reverse. Alan reached up and tried to pull himself through the narrow slot, but his shoulders caught on the stone. There was no room to maneuver, no leverage. The soaked fabric of his shirt clung to his body, making every motion harder. His muscles, already chilled and fatigued, began to fail. He twisted, shoved, and pushed, but each attempt only wedged him in tighter. Above him, Lewis and Moore noticed something was wrong. They tried to pull on the rope to help, but the slot was too tight for any meaningful assistance. Alan was stuck. Time passed. The cold inside the cave worsened. His clothes, soaked from the walls, offered no warmth. The narrow space pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Shivering, barely able to draw full breaths, he realized his strength was slipping away. His teammates lowered warm clothing and a thermos of hot drink, hoping to fight off hypothermia. Alan drank what he could, but his situation was growing more dire by the minute. Eventually, he called out to the others and told them what no caver ever wants to admit, that he couldn't do it anymore, and that they needed to get help. Lewis and Olson hiked out quickly and called the East Tennessee Cave Rescue Team. Within 2 hours, expert rescuers arrived on the scene, bringing specialized gear. When they reached Alan, he had been trapped for nearly 5 hours. His face was pale, and his limbs trembled from the cold. The rescuers evaluated the situation and set up a complex pulley system. There was no room for error. Inch by inch, they pulled him up through the slot, scraping past stone that dug into his ribs and shoulders. Alan clenched his teeth against the pain. Finally, after an hour of careful work, Alan was free. He emerged from the cave exhausted and soaked, but alive. Though his legs shook and he could barely stand, he insisted on walking back to the car himself. Later, he admitted he had underestimated the cave. Midnight Creek Cave. On May 11, 1996, a team of 11 experienced cavers and government safety experts entered Midnight Creek Cave in California. The cave had been sealed since 1994, after dangerous levels of hydrogen sulfide were detected in the water. This mission wasn't recreational. It was a controlled expedition to assess environmental safety and air toxicity. The team split into smaller groups to cover more ground. One group, made up of Richard Breisch, Colin O'Neill, Kurt Wexel, and Renee Van Vrieswijk, headed upstream. They monitored gas levels with detectors and tested the water for chemical content, especially sulfur. The air readings were stable, the structure seemed solid, and nothing indicated trouble. But on the way back, everything changed. Richard led the group along a narrow stream path. He stepped onto what looked like solid rock, covered in moss from constant water flow. Without warning, he slipped and disappeared into a hidden vertical chute beneath the water's surface. The shaft was barely 3 feet in diameter, just enough for a body to fit. Richard fell feet first, landing upright but twisted. His head dipped below the rushing current, and his legs were pinned. Cold water surged into his nose and mouth as he tried to breathe. Wedged in place, with his chest compressed against unyielding stone, he strained upward to find a pocket of air. For a few moments, he feared no one had seen his fall. Panic surged. His muscles trembled as he lifted his head for air. The water stung his face and made him cough uncontrollably. The risk of hydrogen sulfide exposure added a silent, deadly pressure to the moment. Colin O'Neill had witnessed the fall and rushed to help, but in his haste, he also slipped and fell into the chute. The impact drove Richard deeper, wedging him more tightly. Colin managed to brace himself above Richard and called out for help. Renee and Kurt arrived quickly. Together, they pulled Colin out, but Richard remained trapped. His face reappeared from the water briefly, pale and panicked, before slipping back under. Each time he resurfaced, his breathing was more labored. Time was slipping away. The team considered their options. One attempt to push Richard downward only drove his shoulder into jagged rock, causing him to cry out in pain. His legs twisted awkwardly, worsening his condition. The chute gave no room to maneuver. Kurt and Renee studied their map under weak lamplight. They identified a possible alternate route, a narrow, flooded tunnel that might lead beneath the chute. It was risky and tight, but the only viable option. While Kurt and Renee made their way around, Colin stayed with Richard, trying to keep him calm. But Richard's strength was fading. His lips had turned blue. His head slipped underwater more frequently, and each time it took longer for him to lift it back. His body shook violently, and the effort to breathe became a torment. Renee and Kurt finally reached the base of the chute, drenched and cold. At the same moment, Van arrived from above. Without hesitation, they coordinated. Van grabbed Richard's legs. Renee and Kurt pushed from below. The chute's walls scraped his skin as they moved him, inch by inch. Richard's ribs ached, and his dislocated shoulder sent sharp pain through his upper body, but he began to rise. His face cleared the waterline. For the first time in nearly an hour, he could breathe freely. Encouraged, the team pushed harder. With one final effort, his torso broke free. Colin grabbed him and pulled him onto the ledge. Richard collapsed, trembling, soaked, and gasping, but alive. He had survived one of the cave's most dangerous traps. Now came the second challenge, getting out. Richard had lost his glasses during the fall and couldn't see clearly. As the only one familiar with the cave's layout, the burden of navigation fell to him. The carbide lamps gave just enough light to reveal wet stone and shadows. Every bend looked unfamiliar. Still, he pressed forward. The journey back was slow. Narrow crawls, slick rock, and exhaustion made each step harder than the last. But the group stayed close, offering support when Richard stumbled. His memory of the cave's layout proved accurate enough to guide them forward. After what felt like hours, they reached the surface. Cool night air rushed over them. The stars above shimmered quietly. The nightmare was over. Mystery Cave Sinkhole. On January 9, 1993, under a gray sky, Don Biddle drove alone down muddy back roads in Perry County, heading toward a small sinkhole near Mystery Cave in Perry County, Missouri. Heavy rain had fallen the week before, nearly 5 inches, saturating the ground and weakening the limestone beneath. It wasn't ideal weather, but Biddle, a passionate cave explorer, was undeterred. He parked at the forest edge around noon. The temperature was just above freezing, about 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Wearing thermal underwear beneath a waterproof suit, he packed a headlamp, tools, water, and a thermos of hot coffee. The sinkhole he was revisiting wasn't large, about 6 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 12 feet deep, but it had shown signs of leading to a new cave system. A week earlier, he'd partially uncovered a small opening at its base. But when he arrived, he found that the rain had collapsed the excavation. Mud had filled the hole, covering the entrance completely. Still, Biddle got to work. For 3 hours, he dug methodically, piling wet clay along the sloped edges. The work was exhausting. He paused occasionally to sip coffee and warm his hands. Around 3 p.m., he bent down to inspect a potential opening when the slope above him gave way. A wave of mud and rock collapsed into the sinkhole, burying him to the waist in seconds. The weight was staggering. Wet clay clung to his legs, locking them in place. Calmly, Biddle tried to dig himself free. He cleared down to his knees, again and again, but the suction was too strong. Each effort ended with more mud settling in. As the sun went down, the situation worsened. Rain began to fall again, slowly filling the sinkhole. Biddle did the math. The water was rising about an inch every 15 minutes. At that rate, he had maybe 6 or 7 hours before it reached his face. By 7 p.m., it was at his midsection. His thermal gear, soaked through, began draining heat from his body. Hypothermia set in. His legs were numb. His hands, raw from clawing at the clay, trembled. He tied a length of webbing around his waist and anchored it to a nearby tree, just in case he lost consciousness. 30 miles away, Biddle's wife grew worried. He had promised to be back by 7 o'clock. By 8 o'clock, with no answer on his phone, she began calling around. By 9:15, she contacted 2 experienced cavers, Steve Taylor and Gene Kraka, who immediately prepared a rescue. Meanwhile, Biddle was still conscious, but slipping. His thoughts drifted to family. He called out occasionally, but his voice barely carried in the rain. The rescue team reached the forest by 10:30 p.m. His wife led them through 40 acres of woods, rain soaking their gear. At 10:45, she stopped. She'd heard something, a faint voice. They followed it. At 11 o'clock, flashlight beams revealed the sinkhole. Don Biddle was submerged to the neck, barely breathing. His arms were free but swollen. His fingertips were bleeding. He recognized them, but said he thought it was too late. Rescuers gave him coffee, pressed heat packs against his skin, and began rigging a rope system. But the clay held fast. Even with mechanical advantage, they couldn't pull him free. By midnight, firefighters arrived. Pumps couldn't be used due to fumes, so they formed a bucket chain, passing water by hand. By 2 a.m., They'd lowered the water to his chest and could dig more effectively. At 3:30, with his legs finally loosened, 8 rescuers pulled together. With a final heave, Don Biddle came free. Nearly 13 hours after he'd been trapped, he was pulled from the sinkhole, alive. Wrapped in blankets and carried by ATV to a waiting ambulance, he was treated for hypothermia, minor injuries, and frostbite. He would make a full recovery. Snowhole Cave Nightmare. Snowhole Cave was the kind of place that swallowed light. Even near the entrance, beams from headlamps seemed to vanish into the damp blackness. For seasoned cavers, it was a challenge. For anyone unprepared, it was a trap. On July 13, 1994, 3 experienced cavers, Aaron Gisberg, David Eck, and Kevin Allred, descended nearly 600 feet into Snowhole. The trip had already lasted hours. Mud and sweat coated their bodies. Their muscles ached from crawling, climbing, and squeezing through one constriction after another. Now, on their way out, they approached the cave's most infamous obstacle, a vertical fissure known as the Stripper. Barely wide enough for a human chest, it compressed climbers tightly as they ascended. Gravity had made the descent easier. The return would be different. Aaron went first. Kevin stayed behind with David. The plan was for David to climb next, while Kevin waited below. David positioned himself under the fissure, knowing exactly how tight it had been on the way in. Climbing upward would be far worse. He reached for the rope, took a breath, and started the ascent. As soon as he entered the fissure, the pressure closed in. The walls pressed hard against his ribs. He exhaled and pulled himself upward, inch by inch. A gear pack hung from his harness on a short tether, swinging beneath him. Every movement was a struggle. His chest scraped against the cold, wet walls. Then he stopped moving. No matter how he pushed or twisted, he couldn't get free. The fissure held him firmly. He realized the pack below was caught, pulling him down. Without space to adjust, it was acting like an anchor. He called down to Kevin and explained that he was stuck. Kevin urged him to drop the pack, reminding him that it was only making things worse. David hesitated. The pack contained everything: batteries, food, gear. But after nearly an hour of failed attempts, he finally let it go. The sound of it falling echoed up the shaft, but nothing changed. His body was still trapped. He tried again and again, but the walls refused to let him go. The longer he stayed wedged in place, the weaker he became. His breathing was shallow. His limbs trembled. Kevin eventually climbed up beneath him and said he'd try to help. He braced himself in the narrow shaft and pushed against David's boots. David strained upward, but the movement was barely noticeable. He slipped back into place, still stuck. Kevin called out to Aaron, who had already moved closer to the entrance. Hearing the urgency in Kevin's voice, Aaron returned to the fissure. When he looked down and saw David motionless, he acted fast. He secured a rope to an anchor point and lowered it down. Kevin managed to wrap the rope around David's torso. Aaron began to pull. At first, there was no movement. Then, slowly, David's body began to shift. The rope bit into his sides. His lungs expanded. The rock scraped against his body with every inch, but he was moving. With one final pull, the rock finally let go. Kevin caught David as he slumped forward. He was shaking, his limbs barely responding. He had been trapped for over 2 hours. Once David had regained some strength, the two began the slow ascent. Every step hurt, but the air grew fresher with each foot they climbed. Eventually, the narrow passage gave way to open space. They stumbled out of the cave, into the daylight. David collapsed on his back. No one expected him to make it out alive, but he did. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.